I want to talk to you about a subject that affects all of your lives, but I want to talk to you in a way that will surprise you, because the story that I want to recount is fundamentally an optimistic story. And usually if you are brave enough to venture out and come to a talk about corruption, you think, there must be something masochistic about me. Why am I doing this? It's such a terrible world. There's so much corruption. But I think you'll find by the time I'm finished in 20-odd minutes that you may share my enthusiasm in believing this is a problem that we can tackle, that we can do a great deal about, and that, in fact, a lot is happening right now that we should take encouragement from. I do not want to sugarcoat this story. There are millions of people in the world in terrible poverty who are there trapped in that poverty because of the corruption of their governments. There are many countries, for example, that are enormously rich in natural resources, and yet all the benefits of their oil production and oil exports and mining exports do not go to the people. They go abroad into the private bank accounts of the government officials, their cronies, their friends, their families. This is a human tragedy of enormous proportions. It is a tragedy that can only be seen from that perspective through the lens of basic human rights. When a young woman, for example, in Nigeria, manages to get to university, gets through poverty, manages to get through school, gets to university, and finds that her teacher there demands that she buy extra school notes because otherwise she might not pass the exams, he says. She doesn't need those notes, but he wants the income. She says to him, well, she can't afford to pay what amounts to a bribe. And he then asks her for sexual favors. And she refuses. And that's the end of her university opportunity. She gets failing grades. That happens to tens of thousands of young women around the world. That is a fundamental abuse of her human rights. The cause we can put under the umbrella of corruption, but this is human rights at its worst. We're very lucky tonight to have Annabelle Cruz here with us. Annabelle is from Uruguay, and Annabelle is the chair of a group called the Partnership for Transparency Fund. Annabelle has been the chair of Civicus, which is a global umbrella organization for civil society. And Annabelle knows from the work that we are doing at the Partnership for Transparency Fund how we are trying, under the umbrella of anti-corruption, to directly address the enormous abuse, mainly of women and children, young people, in very, very poor countries. That's one element. But corruption has many other tentacles. It affects our basic security. When some Chechen terrorists pay a couple of $100 at Moscow airport so that they can get through the security guards and plant bombs on a couple of airplanes and 200 people die, that is how it affects our lives and the security of our world. What I want to do tonight is I want to do two things. I want to take you a bit on a journey from the collapse of the Berlin Wall through the Arab Spring to show just where we've come from. And then I want to spend a few minutes talking about some of the enormous challenges we confront, challenges that relate to building democracy, to human rights, to development, economic development itself, to our financial system, to natural resources, and also to geopolitical strategic issues. When I was writing this book, I wrote a section about Fujimori in Peru, president now in prison. And so I emailed my friend Jose Ugaz in Peru, who is was one of the chief prosecutors of Fujimori, and said, Jose, could you please read the section I've done on Peru, and if you like the book, please endorse it. And he emailed me straight back, and he said, Frank, I will certainly read the section. I'd love to endorse the book, which he subsequently did. But right now I'm preoccupied because they've just found a bomb under my car. I wrote to Elena Panfilova in Moscow to check out some facts about corruption in Russia. And if I forget, please, somebody ask a question about Sergei Magnitsky later on tonight. And I wrote to her about this, and I asked her to check that section, and if she liked the book, could she endorse it? And she wrote back she'd love to. And she did. But Elena, previous week, had been at the shopping mall with her teenage sons buying jeans, and she got so fed up with the goons who were following her that she turned to them and said, can't you leave me alone for a few minutes? Elena is a very prominent civil society activist in Russia, in addition to running TI Moscow, Transparency International Moscow, Russia. And Elena was so cross that the next morning she went to her office and she bashed a letter out on her keyboard to the Minister of Interior and said, don't touch me. Don't even go after me. I'm fed up with this. I've got friends all over the world who will come to protect me if you do anything to me. But she didn't press the send button. And 2 days later, somebody from the Ministry of Interior called her up and said, I hear you've complained. Elena doesn't have to press send. There are people like Jose and Elena and friends of mine in Venezuela and in Sri Lanka and Mary Jane Ncube, who's an incredibly tireless and brave woman in Zimbabwe, and in many, many other countries today, who are leading growing civil society organizations in the fight for democracy, for human rights, and against corruption, for justice. They are having incredible success. They are enormously brave. They are my inspiration. I hope they will be your inspiration, especially if you read the book, because this is a book about them. These are some of the heroes who we don't hear enough about, but who are making such an enormous difference in this world and makes me optimistic. Now, let me just flash back for a second and say to you that I gradually learned about corruption in different ways from different places. I was a reporter who happened to come here in 1974 with the Times of London as a correspondent, and there happened to be a story called Watergate, which was a good opening education. I then spent 9 years of the 1980s working the external relations of the World Bank and traveled very widely and learned about poverty to a greater extent than I knew about it. I learned an enormous amount in a wonderful institution, and I learned about corruption firsthand in very poor countries. And then I left the World Bank, and I went back to Nairobi, and I sat down with an old World Bank friend of mine called Peter Eigen, who was the World Bank's executive director responsible for Eastern Africa, based in Nairobi. And Peter just poured his heart out at how frustrated he was that nobody was doing anything about corruption. That even at the World Bank, they refused to really listen to him when he said, we've got to do something about it and stop this massive leakage of funds. And gradually, Peter spoke to lots of other people. And exactly 20 years ago, in the spring of 1993, we set up Transparency International.